Jolly good stuff. So without further ado then, Marek McGann, please take it away. Emergence from what though?
Okay, wanted to say thanks very much. Thanks, Rob, for the invitation. It's not too often. I've never been to Portugal or Lisbon, so it's wonderful to be here. I briefly attempted a Lisbon-based virtual background, but it turns out that was a bad idea. So, but it's nice to be in this kind of company at any time, and so I am very grateful for the invitation and for the opportunity to work through some of these ideas. I guess I will flag that there's a certain rawness to them, which I'm hoping you might be able to help me out with. But this is the first slide as well is a slide of history more than anything else. So I'm going to jump. So Rob has introduced my background. We both went to Sussex, and during the time, as you mentioned, that the inactive approach was certainly burgeoning there within a number of the different laboratory groups. And so I'm a product of that process, and I haven't managed to shake it since, essentially. So in this, just briefly talk essentially about, this isn't an argument for embodied cognition, this is just where I'm coming from in terms of embodied cognition. And so I guess just there will be either assumptions I've made or understandings that I've taken which you may not share. It's the nature of, I love these kinds of interdisciplinary groups, but the nature of any kind of interdisciplinary group is argumentative, really, I guess. So I'm perfectly comfortable with those arguments and I'm happy to have them, but this first slide, I guess, isn't going to be argumentative. It's just going to be, this is where I'm coming from. So the promise of embodied cognition, which comes in so many different flavors, for me has to do with essentially, if we might characterize or caricature traditional cognitive science as essentially examining what's going on inside the brain, and embodied cognition added the body to that discussion, and the whole point to adding the body to that discussion was to incorporate the world in some way. So is that, and this for me has, we can just be empiricists and believe so find this satisfying, because this is the world I observe. It fits, whether we want to call it just an empirical standpoint or we want to talk about phenomenology. This is the set of relationships that I experience, and most of the people that I discuss experience. Whereas cognitive science has a tendency to push the body and the world inside the brain, and that's where everything else is going on, and that breaks certain kinds of the relationships between me and the world that I find important to explaining and understanding my own experiences and my own and what I understand about other people's minds and cognition. So that understanding and grasping that relationship between person and world, really, if we consider the brain as a really important but fundamentally part of the body that's interacting with the world, that just sort of changes our perspective a little bit. And as I said, that's really just where I'm coming from. So the net result is that I'll be drawing heavily on work within ecological psychology as derived primarily from the work of James Gibson, and inactive cognitive science, which has derived, it's sort of inaugurated, as is traditionally described, by Varela, Thompson and Roche's 1991 book, The Embodied Mind. Both of these accounts have expanded, though not to any great extent. So Rob, for example, talked about a big meeting that happened in San Sebastian last year, in which people from both of these traditions, who have a lot in common but actually don't talk to each other very much, were all brought together. And I'm always reminded of book review. So there was a 2001 book, which is wonderful for a whole range of reasons, by Harry Heft. It's called Ecological Psychology in Context, and it draws the philosophical and historical relationships between William James's radical empiricism and the contemporary approaches to ecological psychology. It essentially shows how Gibson is a descendant of James, quite directly in terms of PhD supervision. Gibson's supervisor was supervised in turn by James, but also philosophically and theoretically. And in a review of it, there was Ed Morris talked about the size of scientific communities, and he was working within the domain of applied behavioral analysis, right? So ABA has a division within the American Psychological Association, and when they have their division conference, 3,000 people show up. When the ecological psychologists get together and have their conference, 300 people show up. And when the enactivists get together and have a conference, 30 people show up. So what constitutes a big meeting, it's a little bit bigger than that, I'm being a little bit glib, but the orders of magnitude are sort of in that kind of vein. There were about 50 people in the room last year, which constituted certainly nowhere near all, but a substantial proportion of the inactive research community, as it were. Small but scrappy, though. As far as I'm concerned, we're nevertheless, you don't have to be many to be right? So again, to put that in perspective, what is it then that the ecological psychologists and activists are saying that is interesting? And insofar as it's about that relationship between, again, I'm going to slide, some people really get upset when we sort of slide across descriptions like this, but if we want to talk about the cognitive agent or the organism or the system or the person, that relationship between an agency and its environment, in both ecological and inactive approaches, we get a lot of similar kinds of descriptions of that relationship. And Escher is the only one who could possibly illustrate it. So it's starting with Merleau-Ponty in 1962, and Varela, Thompson, and Roche consider their work to be a continuation of Merleau-Ponty's. The world is inseparable from the subject, but a subject which is nothing but a project of the world, and the subject is inseparable from the world, but from a world that the subject itself projects. So we have immediately this codependent relationship, and the sort of recognition that any observation or any description of the world is always from a point of view and dependent upon the capacities of the agent engaged in that observation. And then similarly, the agent obviously is dependent in some way on the world for its existence. Gibson has just a section heading, the mutuality of animal and environment. Animal and environment make an inseparable pair. Each term implies the other. That's quite a strong relationship, right? So no animal could exist without an environment surrounding it. And that was one of the ways in which Gibson essentially pushed off in order to understand the organism, look at the environment, because the two, the two are one essentially in some crucial way. And I think actually I'm going to be really controversial, and I think ecological psychologists really drive this idea home, but I think they've also drifted off some of the implications of it. Varela, Thompson, and Roche use similar kind of language. Living beings and their environments stand in relation to each other through mutual specification or co-determination. Again, this reciprocal relationship of the complementarity or mutuality, as Fulton, and Corello put it, in a criticism of ecological psychologists, by ecological psychologists of enactivists, and published in Constructivist Foundations in 2016. Right? So a complementarity or mutuality encourages ecological psychologists to treat the animal environment systems, the whole thing, as the irreducible unit of analysis for understanding perception and action. So there's this constant rhetoric, and these are just illustrative just quotations. We can keep going, and the kinds of vocabulary that get used are all working within the same thematic view. So we talk about this mutuality of agent and environment, or co-specification, or co-determination, or complementarity, or reciprocality, right? Reciprocal relationships between the animal and the environment. And that means that we don't want to start anywhere. So what we have is this circular relationship between agent and environment. And the net result is, if you pick any one of them and say, well, this is where it all begins, this is what really matters, and everything else follows, then you are going to miss half of the story. And so rather than a sort of a straight causal story, we have some kind of circular causal story. And both approaches depend, but not in any systematic or really terribly disciplined way, as far as I'm concerned, on the concept of emergence, that agent and environment emerge together. And sometimes they even talk about co-emergence, right? That these two things, the agent and the environment, that are we're trying to understand in order to understand cognition and cognitive, in order to do cognitive science in a consistent and satisfying way. Well, we need to understand how agent and environment emerge together. So I'm not going to get too much into the issue of emergence per se, but this does kind of imply kind of a curious question, I think, that hasn't seen an awful lot of explicit discussion, which is emergence from what? Because if you want to not be an old school realist, now again, I'm not sure if anyone's ever anything but a realist, right? No one says the world isn't real. It's just, well, reality is one version of something or another. But the question of how you get an animal and its environment or an agent environment, including us, without coming down subtly or implicitly on one side or another of that equation, is tricky. So I think there's a crucial question that we need to try and get to grips with, and I think we're only really beginning to do it. But I do think we need to do it more explicitly than we've been doing, and really, I guess that's principally all I want to try and illustrate with the talk today. Is emergence from what? Now, the term I've decided to use, the term I'm sort of running with in general, is the notion of a medium. There is some medium within which emergent structures arise, and those structures have a cognitive relation as inherent within them. And there are different senses of the medium extant within cognitive science and explicitly within ecological and enactive cognitive science. None of which are being deployed explicitly for this purpose, but nevertheless, I think implicitly characterized. Sorry if you're getting odd audio artifacts. My dog is scratching and jumping and shaking here. So my apologies if as long as it doesn't start barking, we might be all right. So yeah, the notions of medium have been deployed within ecological and enactive cognitive science, but they haven't been explicitly for this purpose. But I think nevertheless, the ways in which the term has been deployed illustrate some of the commitments that these schools of cognition imply, adhere to, and I think sort of highlight some of the challenges and questions about how it is we go about doing science, or I think we're pre-science, so doing sort of philosophy in this area. So I want to thank Ed Baggs, who in a review of a paper that came out of that San Sebastian workshop, just kind of characterized or tried to summarize what I was trying to get at in teasing apart this notion of medium. We might talk about three different ways in which the term medium gets used. So the first is, all right, something very strange has happened. There we go. We'll go back. Now we're back. Turn it off and on again, and things work. The medium contains the environment. Okay, and as we'll see, this is essentially the way the term medium is used by ecological psychologists. The environment is there, and the medium is the means by which the agent comes in contact with the environment. Inactivists have a more fundamental view of the medium, and this largely derives, in fact, from the minimalist and organic approach that they take to understanding the emergence of cognitive systems. For them, the medium is the environment. Right? It's not the animal or organism or agent can never not be in contact with the environment, because the medium is the environment and the agent is embedded within it. And I think both approaches also have within them an implication of what is in fact a more fundamental view of the medium, which is the medium incorporates both agent and environment. And that's why I think it's promising as an approach to try and get at this idea of, well, if we're going to discipline the way we talk about emergence of agent and environment in co-specification or co-determination or mutual existence, or whatever phrase we want to use, that medium is really what we're is perhaps a good way of trying to frame those questions. So in the first instance, in the ecological approach, the medium contains the environment and the medium mediates. Right? So it achieves some means of contact. In the second case, the medium is the environment and the medium surrounds. And then in the third case, the medium incorporates both agent and environment. And in this case, we're really talking about a medium in the same way that an artist would. The medium is that domain in which we work and the means by which we achieve what we're trying to achieve. I mean, in the case of cognitive science, it's a specification of an agent and environment that exists in some kind of mutual relationship. So thanks to Ed, I'd say it's Twitter profile picture there. So quickly then to review how the concept of medium has been deployed within cognitive science in a manner that's kind of relevant to this approach. Historically, Fritz Heider, in a paper that was initially published in German and then translated as part of a collection of his works in the 1950s, distinguished between thing and medium. And the medium or a medium is sort of contrasts with things. Things have an explicit structure and they keep that structure. The medium is homogeneous and rather structureless. And that homogeneity or that lack of structure allows it to adopt the structure of things. So the structure of a thing can impose itself on a medium. And essentially that's what's, those are the principal characteristics that distinguish between the two. And because the medium does not change in and of itself, because it has no structure of its own, this allows the transmission of the structure of things, because once the structure of the thing becomes imposed on the medium essentially will maintain that structure unless something else happens. It's almost like it'll continue to move unless acceleration or some kind of force is applied upon it. And that means that a medium allows for the transmission or transfer of structure from one place to another, and that's the means by which the medium mediates and enables perception. And Gibson depends substantially on Heider in terms of the way that he deploys the term. And Gibson kind of talks about this triad between surfaces, substances, and the medium. And the medium is as I said, it's the thing that enables the contact between the agent and the surfaces, which essentially delineate where one substance ends and another substance begins, or one object ends and another object begins. But when he talks about the medium, it's actually usually in quite concrete terms because he's interested in visuomotor action in terrestrial animals for the most part. But crucially, it's this shift from talking about animals as just living in space to existing in a medium that brings with it a whole host of implications that from which flow Gibson's whole field of view. So instead of geometrical points and lines which exist in empty space, we have points of observation and locomotion. That is, the medium is filled. There's always a perspective involved. There's always the agent in terms of movement and points of observation. And so it's not abstract. And then sort of in terms of the medium that terrestrial animals live in, well, it's air, right? It's the gaseous mixture that is air. It's relatively homogeneous, certainly, again, in terms of Heider's term, that has not a huge amount of structure to it. It affords respiration, as far as Gibson is concerned, right? These are characteristics of the medium of air. It affords locomotion, so we can live in it and we can move through it. And as such, that's the means by which it becomes a medium for us. And it supports the structuring of energy and chemical arrays. Okay, so for Gibson, the sort of crucial means of contact with the distal environment was through structure in energy arrays, and substantially, again, the 79 or 86 book is about visual perception, so it structures in arrays of light, but the principles are much more general than that and apply to any domain of perceptual experience that you care to engage in. It just depends a little bit what kind of energy is involved, and also, so in some cases it's not energy. So in the case of smell and taste, for example, it structures in chemical arrays. But nevertheless, in the case of air, because air is transparent, it allows light to move, because light moves so quickly, and sources of light are often slow moving. Then the structure of light will come out of radiate from the source of light, bounce off the objects, and sort of continue to flow and bounce to the point where they're almost static, right? So the light is continuously flowing, but the structure in that light, in the way that those light rays are bouncing, becomes reliable within a very short period of time, because light goes super duper quickly. So and certainly in terms of our relationship to it. And it's that structure in the light, the way that the light has been structured by the reflections of objects, that allows us to perceive those objects, and we engage with it. The structure in the light specifies that object, and that's actually going to be a point that's going to be important down the line. The terrestrial medium also has an absolute axis of reference, and this is something else that's going to come up crucially down the line when we start to pick apart how this definition of medium and the way that Gibson describes it is actually not hugely, has some inconsistencies in it. So the terrestrial medium has an absolute axis of reference, which is an up and down reference, right? Because of gravity, the terrestrial, the world we live in has a down, and that down is essentially independent of the perceiver, and it's shared by all perceivers. But in this case, the medium, as I said, is explicitly, in the case of terrestrial animals, it's air, and the medium contains the environment, right? It's this just kind of wide open. It's full of the environment, and the environment has all the objects in it and all our relationships to it. In contrast to that, then, we have the enactive approach to the medium, again, implicit just in the way that the term gets used by enactivists, but I think importantly telling. So Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela in The Tree of Knowledge in 1987, they talk about an animal being born in a particular place, in a medium that constitutes the ambience in which the system, emerges and in which it interacts. So immediately there's an embedding which is substantially shared with that notion of with Gibson's notion, right? So for Gibson, the medium, the medium is full and the animal is embedded in it. But in this case, the emphasis is really placed on that embedding and the situatedness of it. The animal can't get out of the medium, as it were. The medium just is everything that it's interacting with. Crucially, though, if you think about it, this medium is immediately non-homogeneous, right? So the environment, there's no question that Maturana and Varela or any activist since suggests that the environment is just a non-homogeneous, a homogeneous fluid mass, because the environment is everything, both the fluidity and the structure and things that we interact. So immediately we're talking about the medium in quite a different way than Haider and that Gibson did following him. And we started to essentially identify relationships between things in the medium that Gibson's descriptions, explicit descriptions, tend to overlap. His work tends to not make that mistake so much. But they also explicitly they don't talk about the medium much, but they talk about a structural coupling with the medium. Right? So here we're back to this co-specification. And in this case, Varela et al. Are talking about the means or mechanisms of that co-determination, which is that the agent is structurally coupled to its medium, and therefore, you can't. The medium isn't mediating now. The medium, the agent is constantly in contact with the medium and is being pushed around by it, and acts by pushing the medium around. So there's no mediation here. They are in contact with one another, and the means is about, well, how do you negotiate that contact? But just as with Gibson, when you start to look at some of those descriptions of the way he used the term medium, there are some sort of niggling inconsistencies. This is also true in the enactive approach, where, this is just an illustration of, this is the enactivist's favorite illustration of unmediated, or at least not psychologically mediated interaction with the environment. We have here some bizarre caricature of an E. coli bacterium, which is a cell with the flagella at one end, which allows it to move in particular ways. But of course, the cell itself is not a unity. It is a unity, because everything hangs together because of how it works. But it is nevertheless a complex unity. It's a system of systems, which all are connected and interact with one another in the right kind of way. But they only work and connect and interact with each other in that kind of way because they are embedded in their medium. The cell, the bacterium, can only continue to exist by taking in nutrients from the medium and by engaging in the right kinds of, or maintaining the right kinds of relationships with that medium over time. None of that engagement and that embedding does not require psychological mediation. This is direct perception, because the system, the processes that make up the cell incorporate nutrients from the environment in order to continue the existence of the cell and transform its movement, transform its movements. For example, move in a consistent manner or in a tumbling one. And so, again, the medium is incorporated into the processes of the body and the processes of what makes the organism. And I think essentially that logic is scale invariant for the enactivists. That essentially that same logic applies at any given scale of description, up to and including linguistic interaction. But the medium, and literally this is about 3 lines after the last quote. So on page 196, they're talking about the structural coupling with the medium, and then on page 997, they're talking about the organism and the medium mutually specifying each other. And that's a little bit different to structural coupling. The concept of structural coupling would seem at least to kind of acknowledge how much bigger the medium is than the agent. That the agent's got to cope with it. But in this sort of second quotation, just a couple of sentences later, the organism and the medium have been brought to the same scale in some way. And that jump in scales isn't flagged and I think isn't addressed in a consistent manner. So, but, and as you can see, it's rather a big but. There are these consistencies, or these inconsistencies in the way that the concept of medium is deployed, and they are there right from the get-go. Right? So Hyder gets at them in its initial piece, but my favorite description of them is by Paul Scoggin, who I'll mention again in a couple of minutes in terms of his work with Roger Barker and behavior settings there's a sort of a collection of research done on the way in which human beings work. But Scoggin talks about and drawing very much on Hyder here, is that one scales thing is another scales medium. If you're small enough, the air isn't a fluid thing. So if we go full science fiction and put on an Ant-Man suit and reduce ourselves to the subatomic level or the atomic level, then we're getting battered by highly charged and or neutral atoms in various ways, rather than moving simply and fluidly through the terrestrial medium that is the air. So, and again, the simple scale, we don't have to go as small as Ant-Man, or I guess depending on how big or small we decide to be going with that one. But insects themselves, right? The way flight can work for insects is entirely different to the way flight works for us, as in our mechanical terms, because bumblebees, for example, can just make vortices that are big enough to suck them off the ground in a way that is substantially more difficult for something that is bigger than it, like for example birds and others. So the scale of the thing affects how much the medium around it matters. Scoggin puts this in kind of nicely evocative terms of Lego bricks, or plastic toy bricks, he says, rather neutrally. So if we think of a single Lego brick, then that is a thing. It resists change, it has a specific structure, and it only does, it can't mediate, essentially. If you have a pile of Lego bricks, though, and you're allowed to mess with their relationship, then that pile can come to form new structures. And if you've got a bigger pile, then and you have the means by which that bigger pile can take on the structures of other things, then what is a thing at one scale, with the right levels of degrees of freedom, can become a medium at another scale. And in fact, this is substantially where Scoggin and his colleagues, Roger and Louise Barker and Herb Wright and others were talking, because they in fact talk about human beings as being a medium, the medium by which certain social practices come into existence. So ordinarily, when I think, well, a single human being is a thing, right? We are this person, we are this agent. We have, whether we might have personality traits or habits or cultures or customs. If you put enough of us together, actually, you've got this big amorphous mass with lots of degrees of freedom that you can do interesting things with. And so the concept of the medium is actually substantially dependent on scale, but also the body of the people involved is playing a crucial part in what the medium is. Right? So just even working within researchers who might consider themselves substantially ecological psychologists at the moment. Thomas Suffrigan and Bardi in 2001, and they have a recapitulation of this argument in a very similar paper in 2017, talk about the fact that when ecological psychology or ecological perception occurs, that you always have this energy array that's important, and that structure in that energy array is important. But any given perception by any human being always involves more than just one array of energy. And it's there in Gibson's description, for example, of the absolute axis of reference in air as a terrestrial medium. That, for example, if you are using your sight, if you're sighted, you're lucky enough to be sighted and you're using it in order to walk and get places, then the energy array with which you're interacting is not just the structure of light rays in the air around you, but it includes the gravito-inertial system, your vestibular responses as you move and walk, and your proprioceptive responses. And it will also include optical responses. Now, Gibson includes in his work the concept of a compound invariant or compound structure, where the structure of interest that specifies the object being perceived occurs not just in one energy array, but across the coordination between multiple energy arrays. And Suffrigan and Bardi simply point out that that's going to be the norm. There's almost no circumstance, in fact, in which we are not engaged in a coordination across multiple domains. And as a result, the medium is never going to be unitary. It's not just air, because it'll always involve our body and our physiological responses in terms of things like the gravito-inertial system. It'll also involve the fascia and other aspects of the body that allow touch and proprioception. And the net result is the medium's not mediating anymore. It's medium all the way in and all the way out. And so the global array includes body array. So the body's part of the medium. And as soon as you've got the body part of the medium, then that medium containing the environment relationship vanishes, because the person's actions and the structure of their movements of their bodies become part of how the medium works. Somewhat conversely, Barker and Scoggin, who aren't descended from Gibson, they have a sort of a separately developed notion of ecological psychology, but which Harry Heft, who I mentioned earlier, argues essentially is a complementary and consistent approach. They talk about socio-material medium, right? So Rob, I don't know if this is probably way too generic for you to recognize it, but that's actually a seminar room from Bramber House. So I gave a version of this talk a few years ago, or a somewhat related talk, and was able to use that as an example. But the Barker and Scoggin examined, and there was a whole bunch of them involved, looked at how people actually spend their days. And they actually followed human beings around and took notes of what they did, which is a very bizarre concept for psychologists, but there you have it. They actually did it, watched people in their real lives. And they found that the vast majority of their time are spent in structured settings where the sets of actions are, that are appropriate to that setting are essentially, determined well in advance by sociocultural practices. And of course, we're developing new ones all the time, but we still have a tendency to coalesce around those structures very quickly. And most of our behavior is actually best, if you ever want to make a behavioral prediction, You can only have one piece of information. By far the most useful piece of information is where is the person, what's the behavior setting. If I know you're giving a seminar, I can describe your behavior down to a T without knowing anything else about you. There is no psychological variable that is predictive of behavior to the extent that behavior setting is. But behavior settings aren't just the room, they're not just the physical structure, they are also is this a geography class, is it an English class, is it a cognitive science talk, is it a martial arts lesson? And for Barker and Scoggin, they kind of point out that the people become the medium in that case. Right? You have a flow of people, and you put enough people in there, and the setting shapes them essentially into the pattern behavior. So we have a socio-material medium. And Van Dijk and Kiverstein in just last February actually published a paper in Synthesa in which they talk about this, in which they're explicitly tackling Gibson's notion of the medium, but they point out that the medium depends on socio-material practices, and in fact is largely formed of socio-material practices. And just the nice example that they give, a nice illustration that they give, is for terrestrial animals. So for Gibson, it was just a given. The medium of behavior and perception for terrestrial animals is air, but if you've got the right skills, water can be a medium for you too. You can perceive and move and act in water. If you don't have the right skills, water is not a medium by which you can perceive and move and act. You just drown. But what that means again is that the socio-material practices that allow you to learn how to swim, or make swimming part of what you do, or that make form actions around the essentially form your body into certain kinds of activities, are substantially part of the medium by which we interact. So this is essentially, I have spoken a lot longer than I want to. I have more to do. I think Rob is about 10 more minutes. Right?
Yeah, 10 minutes is fine because we started a little bit late, and also we have a bit more time to discuss today. So that would be fine. I'll give you a call. Yeah, let's say 10 minutes from now.
Cool. So I can run through these last couple of slides fairly quickly, because the main point is done really at this point. And in this, to a certain extent, this can operate as a summary slide, but I will have a couple of further things to say. But in essence, it's there's the slides doing weird stuff again. So we get past the drowning, and we'll drown in technology instead. Okay, so mutualism implies emergence. I think that is, it simply seems to be an implication of the way in which both ecological and enactivists talk. And usually there are occasions when they're quite explicit about it. And I think emergence implies a medium. For something to emerge, there must be some kind of substrate by which we discuss this or characterize and describe the structures that emerge. But the medium is not unitary. And that starts to produce challenges, because it means that we have to talk about a substrate with a certain kind of dynamics in which other dynamics emerge that we want to characterize in terms of cognition and environment and so on. And it's not necessarily just a matter of saying, well, look, there is the physics, and then ecological physics emerges within that. Because if the arguments of ecological psychologists and activists go through, there is a you can't, it becomes too difficult to talk about the world independently of the agent, in essence. So we're always kind of a little bit stuck there. I don't think I'm not nihilistic or pessimistic about this, but it just means that we need to discipline our language a little bit, and I'm not sure we're doing that terribly well yet. And crucially as well, is the medium is not neutral. Essentially, this is an excitable medium. It can, the whole notion of agency means that the agency is able to move and change and have effects within the medium, right? Not just on the medium, but the agency, the medium involves the agent, but also that the agent is never passive, and the environment is never passive. They both have dynamics that are coupled in important ways. And one of the things that sort of derives from that then is that particular bodies matter, right? If the body is part of the medium, and the medium as it needs to be, or as it should be characterized, it can be transformed by the socio-material practices in which that body is embedded, right? So if I'm in a culture that makes swimming a high priority, then water isn't part of my, part of the medium in which I work. But also, if I'm in a culture in which academic talks are made a priority, or oyster catching is made a priority, or oyster catching, what's hard, or tree climbing, the particular bodies and what is a medium, the medium in which I am embedded is different to the medium in which others are embedded. And particular histories of learning and bodily conditioning in socio-material practice will matter. And that means materiality matters as well. There are certain things that are physically possible based on size or effort, or and also then just the infinite texture of, well, how detailed do we want to get? There is always more detail to unearth or to sort of dig down into if we decide to continue to do so. And then both materiality and particular bodies are caught up within these sociocultural practices. I think these are concepts that are being got at by people working in the domain, right? So DiPaolo, Berman, and Barandiran in Sensory Motor Life in 2017 try to get at this notion of, well, how do particular bodies and materiality interact, and how can we think about these in consistent and systematic ways? DiPaolo, Cafari, and Diacher in 2018 in Linguistic Bodies attempt to sort of bridge that gap with socio-cultural practices, and I've already mentioned them by Peterstein, talking about thinking in systematic and explicit terms about the importance of socio-cultural practices as being the stuff of which cognition and action are made. But there's still this is still at a very early stage, because we even, if you talk to any of those groups of people, you get slightly different descriptions of what the body is and what the body is that is playing this role within the environment. So you want to talk about the body is not a unitary, easy to discuss thing. For Varela, Thompson and Varela, or DiPaolo, Cafari and Diacher, we've got organic, sensory motor body, linguistic bodies, and phenomenological bodies. And if the body is making up part of what makes the medium, then all of a sudden we've got to be a little bit more explicit about what we mean by body. There's a sort of they spend several chapters in linguistic bodies trying to do that. But it's kind of interesting that this far into an active cognitive science, there's still a need to try and describe what we mean by body, and there's still a lot of unpacking to do, even subsequent to that fairly extensive work. From the ecological psychologist position, again, the body is often described just in purely physical terms, but Ed Reed sort of breaks it down into a number of different systems, none of which is simply coextensive with the physical organismic body. Right? So they are, there's an orientation system, perceptual systems, locomotor systems, interaction systems, appetitive systems, all of which characterize, they give us some sense of what this non-unitary medium will involve. And that's just at the level of the body. Now, there's obviously a lot more work done in terms of the description of the environment, in terms of structure and arrays and substances and surfaces and so on. But we need to be a little bit more explicit about characterizing the relationship all the way in, as it were, to get all the way through the loop in order to accept it. But there are precedents for this as well within cognitive science. This kind of stepping back and looking what the big picture would look like is a task that's rarely done in cognitive science in general. We tend to get stuck into trying to detail tasks in fine-grained, in terms of their fine-grained minutiae. And so broader, encompassing and unifying theoretical approaches are relatively rare, but they're not non-existent. I think Kurt Levine's work on the life world is an exceptionally good example of this, in which he tries to explicitly start with this agent-environment relationship and unpack the notion of what psychology and behavior are, without ever losing sight of the, that the relationship has both sides to it. And so that kind of emergent zygote-like diagram there, that's not at all accidental, very much following this notion of structure emerging within life for living, is an attempt to do that. But it's not, it had, despite being sort of terribly interesting, it had very little influence in shaping the way in which psychological science gets done. Tim Ingold, who is an anthropologist working in sort of across a range of fields, talks about the meshwork being, again, if we look at Levine's diagram there, it looks quite meshy too. And if you think of each of those lines, rather than being a boundary, think about each of those lines as being a process or in sort of continuing, then we might be able to see how the ways in which these different processes interact with one another produce various kinds of outcomes, whether it again in terms of behavior, experience, or other forms. But Ingold's concept of the meshwork is precisely that, to try and identify, well, what are all of these socio-cultural processes, material processes, personal habits, and organic trajectories that are interwoven, and what kinds of interaction between these processes allow us to see structure emerge that we might identify as behavior or experience. I think Di Paolo et al. In Linguistic Bodies, again, they're sort of trying to get a grasp on all of that, though it's sort of, as is obvious there's a much more kind of linear, progressive notion of these relationships that I think maybe is useful in collaboration or in connection with something more like the meshwork or the life world. But again, at least is trying to identify what those relationships might be. And Eric Riedfeld's work with Julian Kiverstein and others on what they call the skilled intentionality framework, I think it can also be seen in this perspective. Though, again, it tends to be at a quite individual level. So, right, this I'm getting very vague here at the end, but I think there's value in thinking clearly about the different scales of phenomena, and how thinking about, well, what medium are we talking about here? And what kinds of dynamics emergent in that medium are we interested in, that allows us to kind of position ourselves relative to one another and position different work relative to one another. So mind relevant phenomena occur at multiple temporal and physical scales. And this is a very vague, just throwing out a few ideas, really just to try and illustrate that there are such different scales. I don't think it's controversial. We don't clearly theorize the issue there, right? So everyone's happy to accept that that's true, but we don't really say, well, what makes the difference here? What matters in terms of scale, other than the amount of space it takes up, the amount of time it goes on. There's a certain breakdown by discipline, but it's not very clear, and it's definitely not very systematic. And also in terms of, again, we're back to, this is a nice, I love interdisciplinarity. It's the only thing that makes sense to me, because the world doesn't care about disciplines. The phenomena just get on with doing what they do. But in terms of cognitive science, we're much better interdisciplinarity within scales than across them. Anthropology is sometimes referred to as the forgotten cognitive science discipline, despite the fact that everything we do has got to be incorporated within anthropology. Sociology, no one even mentions the cognitive science normally. So where we have it's interdisciplinary, what we really mean is we found some computer scientists to work with, and they will model our psychological theory or our neuroscientific theory, or potentially our anthropological theory. And I think there might be some sense in which, well, if we haven't been clear about the medium we're talking about and how emergent structure can arise, and therefore at what level, essentially emergent properties define their own scale, right? If you look too small, you won't see the emergent property. If you look too big, you'll lose it. But without being able to think in a disciplined way about how structure emerges in a medium, we're going to continue to coordinate badly with one another. And I can see Rob has unmuted himself in order to interrupt. And at that point, I will stop. And just a second. Sorry, I just have to I have to switch off something behind me as well. So I'll stop sharing. And say thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marek, because I guess we're going to go to the question part at the moment. Just before we switch off, I just wanted to say, I mean, that was a great talk. There's lots of things I look forward to discussing with you, actually, reference points for my own work in the future. But it looks like, for those people who are listening to this in the recording, there's lots of questions